Long before laboratories and peer reviews, someone built something we still don't fully understand. You're listening to Made for Sleep, where history unfolds slowly and without urgency. Tonight, we explore ancient innovations. Modern science still can't fully explain, not as mysteries to solve, but as quiet reminders that the past was often more patient and observant than we imagine. Let the fire glow steady as the story drifts through time. And if you'd like, feel free to follow us. Let me know how you're doing in the comments and what time it is where you're listening from. You're about to journey through humanity's most puzzling achievements. Those moments when our ancestors accomplished something that still makes modern scientists scratch their heads and reach for their calculators. This isn't a story of aliens or mysticism, but rather of clever people solving problems with whatever they had at hand, leaving behind creations that whisper questions across the centuries. Settle in as we explore the quiet ingenuity that predated laboratories, the patient craftsmanship that defies easy explanation, and the knowledge that travelled through skilled hands rather than published papers. Picture yourself standing in the Egyptian desert around 2500 BCE, watching workers position a limestone block that weighs as much as a school bus. The block slides into place with barely a finger's width of gap between it and its neighbour. You can't see any mortar, just stone touching stone with the kind of precision that would make a modern mason weep with envy. The Great Pyramid of Giza rises before you, its surface smooth as polished glass under the desert sun. Over 2 million blocks went into its construction, each one cut and placed with an accuracy that engineers today measure in fractions of millimetres. The whole structure sits level to within just 2 centimetres across its 13-acre base. That's roughly the thickness of your thumb spread across an area larger than 7 football fields. Nobody's quite sure how they managed it. You walk closer, running your hand along the base stones. Each block fits against its neighbours so snugly that you couldn't slip a playing card between them. The builders achieved this without modern surveying equipment, without laser levels, and without spirit levels filled with alcohol. They had copper tools, stone pounders, and an understanding of geometry that makes you wonder what else they knew that didn't survive in their written records. The internal chambers present their own mysteries. The grand gallery rises at a precise 26-degree angle, its corbelled ceiling creating a space that feels almost like a cathedral carved from stone. The blocks forming this passage weigh several tons each, yet they're positioned with the kind of accuracy you'd expect from someone assembling a watch, not a mountain. Modern researchers have proposed dozens of theories about construction methods. Ramps feature prominently: straight ramps, spiral ramps, internal ramps, ramps made of sand, and ramps made of brick. Each theory solves some problems while creating others. A straight ramp long enough and gentle enough to drag blocks to the pyramid's peak would require more material than the pyramid itself. Internal ramps leave questions about how workers manoeuvred in confined spaces. External spiral ramps might explain access but complicate the question of achieving such precise angles and alignments. Some engineers suggest the Egyptians used a form of concrete, pouring a limestone mixture into moulds rather than dragging cut blocks. The theory would explain the precision. Pouring is easier than positioning, but analysis of the stones shows natural limestone, complete with fossils and geological features that concrete wouldn't contain. The blocks were definitely quarried, definitely transported, and definitely lifted into place. Then there's the question of time. According to ancient historians, the Great Pyramid took about 20 years to complete. That sounds like plenty of time until you do the arithmetic. 2,300,000 blocks divided by 20 years means roughly 115,000 blocks per year. Divide that by the number of days workers could actually work, accounting for floods, festivals, and the basic fact that even the most dedicated stonemason needs to sleep occasionally. And you're looking at placing a block every 2 to 3 minutes, around the clock, for 2 decades. You watch the sun set behind the pyramid, painting its limestone face in shades of amber and rose. The ancient builders aligned the structure almost perfectly with true north. Not magnetic north, which wanders, but true north, determined by the stars. The error measures less than 1/15 of a degree. They achieved this accuracy 46 centuries before GPS satellites started orbiting overhead. The four sides of the pyramid's base each measure about 230 meters long, and they match each other to within 20 centimeters. That's less error than you'd probably make measuring your living room with a tape measure. The ancient surveyors accomplished this across distances longer than 2 football fields, using tools that archaeologists have found in tomb paintings: wooden set squares, plumb bobs, and lengths of rope. Inside the king's chamber, you'd find blocks of red granite that travelled from quarries 500 miles up the Nile. Each granite block weighs between 25 and 80 tons, as much as a locomotive. How did workers move these monsters onto boats, off boats, and then up into the heart of the pyramid? The question gets more interesting when you learn that the chamber's granite ceiling beams show no signs of sagging after 46 centuries supporting thousands of tons of stone overhead. Engineers have tried to calculate the forces and stresses involved. The numbers work. Barely, if you assume the builders understood engineering principles that wouldn't be formally described for thousands of years. They needed to grasp load distribution, material strength, and structural mechanics. They couldn't test these theories with computer models or calculate them with advanced mathematics. They figured it out through observation, experience, and probably more than a few spectacular failures that didn't survive in the historical record. The subsidiary pyramids and temples surrounding the main structure add more questions. The mortuary temple features massive pillars cut from single pieces of granite. The precision required to shape these pillars without shattering them exceeds what you'd expect from copper tools and sand abrasives. Yet there they stand, their surfaces still showing the marks of ancient tools. Modern attempts to replicate pyramid construction using ancient methods have produced mixed results. Teams have successfully moved large blocks using wooden sledges, rope, and water to lubricate sand. They've cut limestone with copper saws and Mohenjo-daro used by ancient quarrymen, but nobody's yet demonstrated the ability to maintain pyramid-level precision while working at pyramid-level speed. The experimental blocks tend to be rougher, the gaps wider, and the alignment less exact. This doesn't mean the ancient Egyptians had lost technology or secret knowledge. It suggests something perhaps more remarkable. They developed a level of organised craftsmanship that modern civilization, for all its technological advantages, finds difficult to coordinate. Thousands of workers, all trained to extremely high standards, all working in concert, all maintaining precision across years of continuous construction. You think about the planning involved. Someone had to organise quarrying operations, boat transport, construction sequencing, worker housing, food supply, tool manufacture, and maintenance. Someone had to train the workers, inspect their output, and solve problems as they arose. The logistics of building a pyramid might be as impressive as the engineering. The night deepens and stars appear above the desert. The ancient builders used these same stars to align their creation. They watched the northern sky, tracked the circumpolar stars that never set, and somehow translated those observations into the cardinal alignments that still impress surveyors today. No textbooks explained the method. No blueprints survived to show their calculations. They figured it out and achieved it, and then the specific techniques apparently vanished, leaving later civilizations to puzzle over how it was done. You're standing on a dock in the Bay of Naples, somewhere around 100 BCE. Behind you, Mount Vesuvius rises against a clear sky, not yet infamous for the destruction it will rain down on Pompeii. In front of you, workers are building a breakwater that will still be standing 2,000 years from now, long after most modern concrete structures have crumbled into rubble. They're mixing volcanic ash with lime and seawater, creating a material the Romans called opus caementicium. You watch as they pour this mixture into wooden forms submerged in the Mediterranean. The process looks simple enough. Mix, pour, wait. But that mixture will harden underwater into a substance tougher than anything Portland cement can produce in a marine environment. Modern concrete in seawater faces a constant battle. Salt infiltrates the material, attacking the internal structure. Steel reinforcement bars rust and expand, cracking the concrete from within. Wave action erodes surfaces. Chemical reactions weaken bonds. Most modern marine structures need repair or replacement within decades. The Romans built docks and harbours that laugh at ocean storms for millennia. The secret apparently lies in that volcanic ash, specifically the type from Pozzuoli near Naples. When mixed with lime and seawater, something happens at the molecular level that modern scientists are still working out. The seawater doesn't weaken the concrete, it actually makes it stronger. Salt water triggers chemical reactions that grow new minerals within the concrete structure, filling gaps and creating an increasingly dense interlocked network of crystals. You watch a researcher in the present day examining a sample of Roman harbour concrete under an electron microscope. She's looking at crystals of aluminum tobermorite, a rare mineral that forms slowly in the presence of seawater. These crystals reinforce the concrete, growing denser over centuries. The process resembles how a pearl forms in an oyster, layer by patient layer, irritant transformed into strength. Modern concrete aims for fast strength development. Mix it, pour it, and in 28 days you've got most of your final strength. Quick project completion, fast return on investment. Roman concrete took years or even decades to reach its full strength, but it just kept getting tougher. The Romans apparently understood that patience produces different results than haste. The recipe seems straightforward: volcanic ash from specific deposits, lime from heated limestone, seawater and aggregate. Scientists have analysed the proportions, examined the minerals and identified the chemical processes. Yet attempts to recreate Roman concrete that performs as well in seawater have proven frustratingly difficult. The volcanic ash from Pozzuoli is depleted. Alternative volcanic ashes don't behave quite the same way. Modern lime production uses different temperatures than Roman kilns. Small variations in the process produce large differences in performance. You walk along the ancient harbour at Portus, Rome's main seaport. The massive curved breakwater still rises from the water, still protecting what remains of the harbour. 2,000 years of storms, earthquakes and chemical assault haven't brought it down. Parts of the structure were deliberately demolished for building materials in later centuries, but what remains is as solid as ever. The Romans built thousands of structures with their concrete: harbours, aqueducts, buildings, bridges, and the Pantheon's magnificent dome. Each structure used variations of the basic recipe, adjusted for local conditions and specific needs. The dome of the Pantheon shows particularly clever engineering. The concrete changes composition from bottom to top, with denser, heavier aggregates at the base, and lighter pumice toward the apex. The builders understood load distribution and material properties without the benefit of structural engineering textbooks. Modern researchers scratch their heads over the details. How did Roman builders know which volcanic ash to use? How did they determine the right proportions for different applications? How did they train workers to maintain quality control across the vast empire? No detailed recipes survived. No technical manuals explained the process. Later civilizations knew the Romans had excellent concrete, but the specific knowledge of how to make it apparently faded away. By the Middle Ages, European builders had shifted to stone masonry and brick. Roman concrete techniques were largely forgotten, surviving mainly in references to ancient structures rather than as living knowledge. When modern Portland cement was developed in the 19th century, it became the standard despite its poor performance in marine environments. The ancient solution sat there in harbours around the Mediterranean, demonstrating superior durability that nobody quite knew how to replicate. You think about the implications. The Romans created a material that gets stronger with age, that uses seawater as an asset rather than a threat, and that requires no steel reinforcement or exotic chemicals. They did this without understanding chemistry at the molecular level, without electron microscopes or X-ray diffraction analysis. They observed, experimented, refined their methods, and passed the knowledge through craft traditions. Current research projects are attempting to recreate Roman concrete for modern use. The environmental benefits would be substantial. Using volcanic ash and seawater reduces the need for Portland cement, which accounts for about 8% of global carbon dioxide emissions. If we could build marine structures that last 2,000 years instead of 50, the resource savings would be enormous. But the Romans didn't concern themselves with carbon footprints. They just wanted harbours that wouldn't fall apart. The volcanic ash holds particular interest. The ancient sources the Romans used, especially around Pozzuoli and the volcanic region near Rome, contained specific minerals that react in particular ways with lime and seawater. Other volcanic ashes from around the world have different mineral compositions and don't perform the same way. The Romans didn't travel far to find special ingredients. They used what was locally available and developed techniques suited to those materials. This points to another aspect of ancient innovation that modern approaches sometimes miss: working with what's at hand rather than seeking ideal materials. The Romans couldn't order synthetic additives or import specialized ingredients from across the globe. They observed their environment, experimented with local materials, and developed solutions that matched their resources. The result happened to outlast anything modern technology has yet produced for marine construction. You watch waves lap against ancient concrete, each surge depositing minerals that make the structure fractionally stronger. The process continues today, 2 millennia after the builders died, their names forgotten, their techniques partially understood. The concrete doesn't care about historical recognition. It just keeps getting tougher, molecule by patient molecule, proof that sometimes slow chemistry beats fast engineering. You're in a workshop in medieval Damascus, sometime around 1100 CE. The heat from the forge makes the air shimmer, and a smith is carefully tending a crucible, filled with a mixture that will eventually become the finest steel blade of its era. The sword he's making will be able to slice through a falling silk scarf, yet remain flexible enough to bend without breaking. Its surface will show distinctive watery patterns, ripples and swirls that mark it as genuine Damascus steel. No modern smith can reliably recreate it. The pattern on Damascus steel isn't decorative etching or surface treatment. It's the visible expression of the metal's internal structure. Carbide nanotubes and bands of cementite creating variations in hardness at microscopic scales. These patterns contribute to the blade's legendary sharpness and durability. Somehow, medieval smiths created nanotechnology in their crucibles centuries before microscopes could reveal what they were making. The story becomes more puzzling when you realize that Damascus steel wasn't made in Damascus. The city was a trading centre where these blades were sold, but the steel itself came from India, produced through a technique called wootz steel making. Indian smiths heated iron with carbon-rich materials in sealed clay crucibles. The exact heating process, the carbon sources and the cooling rates, all of these factors influenced the final product, and getting them wrong meant the difference between extraordinary steel and ordinary iron. You watch the medieval smith examining his blade, testing its flexibility and checking the edge. He learned his craft through years of apprenticeship, watching masters work, gradually absorbing the subtle cues that indicate when the metal is ready. The knowledge was passed through demonstration and experience rather than written formulas. You either developed the feel for it, or you made inferior blades. Modern metallurgists analysing Damascus steel find structures they wouldn't expect to see from medieval technology. The carbon content forms into precise patterns, aligned and organised at scales that seem to require controlled processes unavailable to ancient smiths. Yet there the structures are, visible under electron microscopes, creating the mechanical properties that made these blades legendary. The secret apparently lay in the ore itself. Deposits in southern India contain trace amounts of certain elements, tungsten, vanadium, and chromium, that acted as catalysts during the smelting process. These elements influenced how carbon organised within the steel's crystalline structure. The smiths didn't know about trace elements or catalytic effects. They knew that ore from specific mines produced better steel, and they guarded those sources carefully. The manufacturing process disappeared around 1750 CE. Several factors probably contributed to its loss. The specific ore deposits became depleted or were exhausted. Trade routes shifted, political changes disrupted established craft networks, and demand changed as firearms replaced swords. Whatever the reasons, the last generation of smiths who knew the complete process died without successfully passing on their knowledge, despite the steel's legendary reputation and high value. Modern attempts to recreate Damascus steel have succeeded in producing similar patterns and some of the mechanical properties, but researchers still debate whether they've captured the exact ancient process. Creating superficially similar results doesn't necessarily mean you've rediscovered the original method. The ancients might have taken a completely different path to reach their destination, using techniques and intuitions that seem obvious only once you know them. You think about the experimental process those ancient smiths must have undertaken. They couldn't analyse the results at a molecular level or measure carbon content precisely. They worked through trial and error, guided by results they could observe: how well the blade held an edge, how it performed in combat, and how the patterns looked on the finished surface. Generations of smiths refined the process, each master adding small improvements or adaptations. The economic value of Damascus steel drove its development and protected its secrets. A blade of genuine Damascus steel costs considerably more than ordinary swords. Smiths who could reliably produce high-quality results enjoyed significant advantages in the marketplace. This created incentives for secrecy and for careful selection of apprentices. Knowledge became proprietary, shared within family workshops or closely guarded craft guilds. This same economic value makes the loss of the technique more puzzling. If Damascus steel commanded premium prices, why didn't more smiths learn to make it? Why didn't wealthy patrons fund efforts to preserve the knowledge when it became clear that the techniques were endangered? The historical record doesn't provide clear answers. Perhaps the smiths themselves didn't fully understand the role of specific ore sources, or the decline happened gradually enough that no single generation recognized the crisis until it was too late. You examine a genuine Damascus blade in a museum collection, its surface showing the characteristic patterns that mark it as authentic. The patterns aren't uniform. They vary from blade to blade, region to region, and even within a single sword's length. This variation suggests that smiths were adapting their techniques to specific circumstances, working with variations in ore quality, and adjusting their processes accordingly. They developed sophisticated quality control without the benefit of modern testing equipment, judging results through performance and appearance. Current research into historical Damascus steel has revealed surprising details. The carbon nanotubes found in the steel form through a self-assembly process during cooling. The trace elements in the ore seed the formation of these structures, but the smith's control of temperature and cooling rates determines the final patterns. It's a delicate balance, and apparently medieval smiths learned to manipulate variables they couldn't directly measure or even conceptually understand. This points to a broader pattern in ancient innovation: solutions that work without complete theoretical understanding. The smiths knew that certain processes produce certain results. They refined those processes through experience. The underlying atomic scale mechanisms remained invisible and unknown, but practical knowledge proved sufficient to create exceptional products. The modern metallurgist studying Damascus steel has advantages the ancient smith lacked: electron microscopes, spectroscopy, precise temperature control, and pure ingredients. Yet reproducing the ancient results proves frustratingly difficult. The metallurgist knows too much, perhaps, seeing complexities that the ancient smith never considered. Sometimes ignorance of the details allows focus on the results that matter. You're on a boat off the Greek island of Antikythera in October 1900, watching sponge divers surface from a shipwreck they've just discovered. One diver emerges talking about dead bodies on the seafloor, corpses that turn out to be bronze statues from an ancient cargo ship. Among the marble sculptures, pottery and bronze figures, someone will eventually notice a corroded lump that doesn't look like much of anything at all. That corroded lump will turn out to be the most complex mechanical device from the ancient world ever discovered, a machine so sophisticated that nothing comparable appears in the historical record for another 1,000 years. It's a portable mechanical computer built around 100 BCE, designed to calculate and display astronomical information, including the positions of the sun, moon, and planets, the phase of the moon, eclipse predictions, and the dates of the Olympic Games. You watch as conservators in the present day carefully X-ray the corroded mass, revealing gears within gears, differential systems, and inscriptions too small to read with the naked eye. The device contains at least 30 bronze gears, possibly more that have corroded away. The gears are cut with precision, their teeth evenly spaced, and their axles aligned with remarkable accuracy. This thing was built by someone who understood mechanical engineering at a level you wouldn't expect to see until Renaissance clockmakers started building astronomical clocks. The front dial displays the Egyptian calendar and the Greek zodiac. Turn a crank on the side and pointers move across the dials, showing how the celestial bodies move through the sky. The back of the device features 2 spiral dials, one tracking the metonic cycle of 19 years used to predict eclipses, another showing the 4-year cycle of the Olympic and other Panhellenic Games. Here's where it gets interesting. The mechanism doesn't just show the positions of celestial bodies, it accounts for the moon's elliptical orbit through an ingenious gear system that speeds up and slows down the moon's pointer to match the moon's actual varying speed across the sky. This requires understanding orbital mechanics that wouldn't be formally described for centuries. Somebody knew that the moon moves faster at some points in its orbit than others, and figured out how to model that variation with bronze gears. The gears themselves reveal sophisticated manufacturing techniques. They're cut precisely, with triangular teeth that mesh smoothly. The gear ratios calculate astronomical cycles with impressive accuracy. The mechanism's metonic cycle dial predicts eclipses using the 19-year pattern that ancient astronomers recognized by careful observation. The designers knew their astronomy and possessed the mechanical skill to translate that knowledge into a working machine. No ancient text describes anything like the Antikythera mechanism. Greek and Roman authors mention simpler astronomical instruments, sundials, celestial spheres, and water clocks, but nothing approaching this device's complexity. Either such machines were so rare that nobody bothered to describe them in surviving texts, or the knowledge of how to build them vanished early enough that later authors didn't know what had been lost. You think about the engineering challenges involved in creating this device. Someone had to design the gear train, calculating the ratios needed to model various astronomical cycles. Someone had to manufacture the gears to sufficient precision that they'd mesh properly and turn smoothly. Someone had to assemble dozens of components inside a wooden case no larger than a shoebox. And someone had to inscribe the detailed instructions on the device's surfaces, explaining what each dial showed and how to interpret the results. The project required multiple types of expertise working in concert: astronomical knowledge, mechanical design skill, metalworking ability, and enough mathematical understanding to translate celestial observations into gear ratios. This suggests the existence of a sophisticated technical culture, probably centered in Rhodes or Alexandria, capable of supporting specialized craftsmen working on complex projects. Modern researchers have built reconstructions of the Antikythera mechanism based on CT scans and detailed analysis of the original fragments. The reconstructions work. Turn the crank and the gears rotate smoothly. The pointers track across the dials, and the predictions match ancient astronomical observations. Building the reconstructions required modern precision tools and computer-aided design. The ancient makers used hand tools and geometric construction techniques, yet achieved comparable results. The device's existence raises uncomfortable questions about the history of technology. If Greek craftsmen could build such sophisticated mechanisms around 100 BCE, why don't we have more of them? Why don't Roman authors describe astronomical computers in their surveys of useful devices? Why did the technology apparently vanish, only to be slowly reinvented in medieval Europe over 1,000 years later? Possible answers include the device's likely high cost. Such a machine would have been affordable only to wealthy patrons, limiting the number ever made. The materials used would have been valuable even after the mechanism's purpose was forgotten, encouraging people to melt down damaged devices for their bronze. And mechanical devices, unlike stone buildings or pottery, rarely survive long in corrosive marine or burial environments. We might be seeing the one example that happened to end up in conditions that preserved it. Still, the Antikythera mechanism suggests that ancient technical capabilities sometimes exceeded what we'd expect based on the surviving evidence. The device wasn't crude or primitive, it was sophisticated and elegant, clearly the product of refined design rather than early experimentation. This implies a development history we can't currently trace, a series of earlier devices and improvements that led to the complex version found in the shipwreck. You examine the gear teeth under magnification, noting how precisely they're formed. The maker used a technique that ancient texts do describe, cutting gear teeth using dividing plates and careful geometric layout. The process was time-consuming but effective. You didn't need power tools or CNC machines to create precise gears, just patience, skill, and good metal. The ancient craftsman clearly possessed all three. The inscriptions covering the mechanism's surfaces amount to an instruction manual, explaining how to use the device and what various features calculate. The text is tiny, requiring good eyesight or optical aids to read comfortably. This raises another question. Did ancient craftsmen have access to magnifying lenses? Roman glassmaking certainly produced vessels and objects with optical properties. Could someone have realized that a water-filled glass sphere acts as a magnifying glass? The evidence is indirect but suggestive. The Antikythera mechanism stands as proof that ancient people could be as smart and capable as anyone living today. They lacked our accumulated knowledge and our power tools, but they didn't lack intelligence or ingenuity. Given sufficient motivation, in this case the desire to predict celestial events for navigation, astrology, or agricultural planning, they developed solutions that look remarkably modern in their sophistication. You're standing in southeastern Turkey, at a site called Göbekli Tepe, looking at stone pillars carved with intricate reliefs of animals. These aren't simple scratches or rough shapes. They're detailed images of foxes, lions, bulls, scorpions and vultures, carved with skill and artistic vision. The pillars stand in circular arrangements, some of them weighing 16 tons, carefully shaped and positioned. Here's what makes your head spin. These structures were built around 9,500 BCE, more than 11,000 years ago. The people who built them were hunter-gatherers, supposedly living in small mobile bands, not yet practicing agriculture, and not yet living in permanent settlements. According to the traditional narrative of human development, you need settled agriculture before you can build monuments. You need food surpluses to support specialist craftsmen. You need complex social organisation to coordinate large construction projects. Göbekli Tepe suggests we've got the story backward. The site covers roughly 90,000 square metres, with multiple circular structures featuring these massive T-shaped pillars. Each circle took years to build, and when one was complete, the builders carefully buried it and started a new one nearby. They did this repeatedly over many centuries, creating layer upon layer of monuments, filling in the old to make way for the new. You watch archaeologists carefully excavating one of the structures. The workmanship shows surprising sophistication. The T-shaped pillars were quarried from bedrock, shaped with stone tools, transported to the site, and erected in precisely planned positions. The circular walls connecting the pillars were built with carefully fitted stones. The whole thing shows design consistency and construction planning that you wouldn't expect from people who supposedly spent most of their time hunting gazelles and gathering wild grain. The animal carvings on the pillars aren't random decorations. They seem to follow symbolic patterns, possibly representing constellations or seasonal markers or mythological narratives we can't fully decode. Some pillars show human arms and hands, suggesting the stones might represent stylized human figures. Whatever the meaning, creating these carvings required skilled stoneworkers spending considerable time on each pillar. Modern experiments in stoneworking reveal how labour-intensive this would have been. Using replicas of prehistoric tools, flint blades and stone hammers, researchers have attempted to carve limestone similar to what the Göbekli Tepe builders used. Creating a few inches of carved relief takes hours of careful work. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe feature yards of intricate carving. Someone invested enormous effort into these monuments. This raises the obvious question: why? If you're a hunter-gatherer living in small mobile groups, why invest years of labour-building monuments? Where did the workers come from? How did you feed them during construction? Traditional archaeology assumes monument building requires settled farming communities because you need reliable food surpluses to support people not engaged in food production. The answer might be that we've misunderstood the relationship between monuments and agriculture. Perhaps building these ritual sites actually motivated the development of agriculture rather than the other way around. If you need to feed large groups of people gathering for festivals or ceremonies at places like Göbekli Tepe, you've got a strong incentive to develop more intensive food production methods. Maybe religion and ritual drove agricultural development, not vice versa. You examine the animal bones found at the site, thousands of them, mostly from wild gazelles and aurochs. The bones show butchering marks, evidence of massive feasts. People were gathering here in large numbers, eating together, and probably participating in rituals or ceremonies we can only guess at. These gatherings required organisation and planning. Someone had to coordinate the hunts, process the animals, and manage the cooking. This level of social organisation supposedly came after agriculture developed, not before. The construction techniques add more mysteries. The pillars were quarried from bedrock outcrops using techniques that left clear marks in the stone. The builders created channels around each pillar blank, gradually undercutting it until they could break it free from the bedrock. Then they had to transport pillars weighing up to 16 tons to the construction site. No evidence of wheels or draft animals exist from this period. They likely used log rollers and human muscle power, which means dozens of people working in coordination. Erecting the pillars required engineering knowledge we usually associate with later civilizations. Each pillar stands in a socket carved into the bedrock floor. The socket had to be positioned correctly for the pillar to stand vertical once raised. Lifting a 16-ton stone into position with Stone Age technology required levers, ramps, rope, and careful planning. Getting it wrong could kill people and destroy the pillar. They got it right repeatedly. The site's deliberate burial adds another layer of mystery. The builders didn't abandon these structures when they moved on. They carefully filled them with rubble and soil, preserving them completely buried. This took considerable effort. Moving enough fill material to cover these large structures required organised labour. Why bury them instead of simply leaving them standing? The act suggests the structures had specific purposes that were completed, or that the burial itself held ritual significance. Modern excavations have revealed only a fraction of Göbekli Tepe. Ground-penetrating radar shows multiple additional circular structures still buried. Archaeologists estimate that uncovering and studying the entire site could take decades. Each new section excavated reveals similar sophistication and raises similar questions about how pre-agricultural people accomplished such construction. You think about the social implications. Building Göbekli Tepe required cooperation among multiple groups. No single hunter-gatherer band could have provided enough labour. People from different bands had to gather, work together on shared projects, and maintain that cooperation over generations. This suggests complex social arrangements, systems of obligation, reciprocity, and shared beliefs that traditionally aren't attributed to hunter-gatherer societies. The site lacks evidence of domestic structures. Nobody lived at Göbekli Tepe permanently. People came, worked, feasted, performed rituals, and left. It was a special place, set apart from daily life. The investment in creating and maintaining such a place suggests it served important social functions, bringing groups together, affirming shared identities, and marking significant events. The monuments became focal points for social organisation. Recent discoveries at sites near Göbekli Tepe show that it wasn't unique. Other stone pillar sites from the same period have been found scattered across the region. This suggests a whole culture of monument building among pre-agricultural peoples, a practice we never suspected existed until Göbekli Tepe was excavated. How many other aspects of prehistoric life have we misunderstood due to lack of evidence? The traditional timeline of human development places agriculture around 10,000 BCE in the Fertile Crescent, with monument building developing several thousand years later once agricultural societies became established. Göbekli Tepe flips this narrative, showing sophisticated monument building before agriculture took hold. Either the timeline needs revision, or our understanding of what motivates and enables monument construction needs rethinking. You're standing on the walls of Constantinople in 678 CE, watching an Arab fleet approach the city. The Byzantine capital has withstood sieges before, but this one looks serious. Hundreds of ships carrying thousands of warriors intent on conquering the richest city in Christendom. Then you see the Byzantine dromons sail out to meet the enemy, and everything changes. From bronze tubes mounted on the Byzantine ships, a liquid erupts in streams of flame that ignite on contact with the Arab vessels. The fire spreads across wooden hulls and doesn't extinguish when hit by waves. In fact, water seems to make it burn more fiercely. The Arab sailors panic as their ships become floating pyres. The Byzantine dromons systematically work through the enemy fleet, spraying fire from their tubes, turning the sea battle into a massacre. This is Greek fire, and nobody's entirely sure what it was made of. The Byzantines guarded the secret of Greek fire more carefully than perhaps any military technology in history. The formula was known to the ruling family and a handful of trusted technicians. Production happened in secure workshops. Using Greek fire required specially designed ships with protected bronze tubes for projecting the substance. For centuries, this weapon gave the Byzantine navy a decisive advantage in naval warfare. Modern historians and chemists have proposed numerous theories about Greek fire's composition. Crude oil features in most hypotheses, since petroleum naturally seeps to the surface in several locations around the Black Sea and Eastern Mediterranean. But crude oil alone doesn't match the described properties of Greek fire, which supposedly ignited spontaneously, burned on water, and couldn't be extinguished with water. Adding naphtha, a volatile petroleum fraction, gets closer to the mark. Naphtha burns intensely and water won't put it out. But naphtha doesn't ignite spontaneously at normal temperatures, and historical accounts suggest Greek fire sometimes did. Some researchers propose adding quicklime to the mixture. Quicklime reacts violently with water, generating heat that could ignite flammable petroleum components. A mixture of naphtha, petroleum, sulfur and quicklime might produce something with properties matching Greek fire's description. You watch a modern chemist attempting to recreate Greek fire in controlled laboratory conditions. She's mixing petroleum derivatives with various additives, testing each mixture for the properties described in Byzantine sources. Some combinations burn impressively but require external ignition. Others ignite spontaneously, but don't burn with the intensity described. Getting all the properties right in one mixture proves elusive. The delivery system adds complications. Byzantine ships used bronze tubes, essentially early flamethrowers, to project Greek fire at enemy vessels. This required pressure to force the liquid through the tube and onto the target. Some historians suggest the Byzantines used force pumps, creating pressure through mechanical pistons. Others propose that the mixture itself generated pressure through chemical reactions. The tubes were apparently carefully aimed, suggesting trained operators developed skill in projecting the fire effectively. Greek fire served as a deterrent as much as a weapon. Enemy fleets knew the Byzantines possessed this devastating weapon, which influenced strategic decisions. Besieging Constantinople by sea became extremely risky. The psychological impact of watching ships burn with unquenchable flames probably exceeded the weapon's actual destructive power, though that was considerable enough. The formula's secrecy became legendary. When the Byzantine princess Theophano married the Holy Roman Emperor Otto II in 972 CE, part of her dowry negotiations included an explicit understanding that she would not reveal the secrets of Greek fire to her new husband's court. The emperor himself apparently took oaths to preserve the secret, recognizing that if the formula became widely known, Byzantine naval superiority would vanish. Despite these precautions, the secret of Greek fire eventually disappeared anyway. By the early 13th century, references to Greek fire fade from Byzantine sources. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204 probably disrupted the secure production system. The workshops were looted, technicians scattered or killed, and the formula apparently lost in the chaos. Later, Byzantine rulers attempted to recreate Greek fire but never achieved the same results. The loss had strategic consequences. Without Greek fire, the Byzantine navy lost its decisive advantage over rival naval powers. Venice and Genoa, with their newer ship designs and better seamanship, gradually dominated Mediterranean naval warfare. The Byzantines still built impressive ships, but they'd lost the weapon that once made their fleet terrifying. You think about the challenges involved in developing Greek fire. The original creators had to experiment with various flammable substances, discovering which combinations produced desired properties. They did this without modern chemistry, without understanding molecular structures or chemical reactions at a theoretical level. They worked through empirical observation, mix this with that, see what happens, and refine the results. Some experiments probably went spectacularly wrong, creating explosions or uncontrollable fires. The weapon's effectiveness depended on accurate targeting and favourable wind conditions. Spraying flaming liquid at enemy ships works well when the wind blows from your stern toward the enemy. If the wind shifts, you risk setting your own ship aflame. Byzantine naval commanders had to understand tactics that maximised Greek fire's advantages while minimising the risks to their own vessels. Modern militaries have analysed Greek fire as a historical case study in secret weapons development and security. The Byzantines maintained operational security for centuries through compartmentalisation, keeping knowledge restricted to small groups, ensuring production happened in secure locations, and making the weapons use dependent on specialised training and equipment. Once that security structure collapsed, the secret couldn't be recovered. Alternative theories about Greek fire keep emerging, as historians find new references in obscure texts, or chemists attempt new experimental reconstructions. Some propose that the Byzantines had multiple formulations, adapting the mixture for different tactical situations. Others suggest that Greek fire became a generic term for various incendiary weapons, not all of which use the same formula. The historical sources don't provide enough detail to resolve these debates definitively. You watch flames reflected on water, thinking about all the knowledge that humans have developed and then lost. Greek fire represents a specific case, a formula forgotten when the social structure preserving it collapsed. But similar losses probably happened countless times in history. Craft techniques, medical treatments, agricultural methods, architectural tricks, all kinds of practical knowledge that didn't get written down or whose written descriptions were too vague to recreate the original discovery. You're in a museum storage room, examining objects that don't quite fit the expected timeline of technological development. Not the flashy headline grabbers that fuel conspiracy theories, but the quiet anomalies that make archaeologists scratch their heads and reach for their reference books. Surprisingly, sophisticated items found in contexts that suggest people knew more than we thought they did. The first object in your hand looks like a simple clay pot, but when you strike it gently, it rings like a bell. A clear, sustained tone that suggests remarkable symmetry and uniform wall thickness. This isn't a wheel-thrown pot from an established ceramic tradition. It's from a site dated to when people supposedly just figured out that heating clay makes it hard. Yet someone created this pot with acoustic properties that modern potters would struggle to duplicate without careful measurement and practice. You set down the ringing pot and pick up a small bronze mirror from Han Dynasty China. The front shows your reflection in polished metal, but flip it over and examine the decorated back in bright light, and something weird happens. You can see the decorations from the back appearing ghost-like in the reflected image on the front. The metal is solid bronze, no tricks with transparent materials. Yet somehow the casting process created variations in thickness and stress patterns that make the solid bronze act like it's partly transparent. How did ancient mirror makers discover this trick? Did they stumble on it by accident and then figure out how to control it? The techniques apparently vanished after the Han Dynasty, leaving modern metallurgists to puzzle over how it was done. Next to the mirror sits a small piece of stained glass from a 12th century church window, the deep ruby red that medieval glaziers achieved by adding gold to the glass mixture. But here's the thing, the colour doesn't come from gold dissolved uniformly in the glass. Modern analysis reveals that medieval glaziers accidentally created gold nanoparticles suspended in the glass matrix. These nanoparticles scatter light in specific ways, producing the rich red colour that became prized in church windows. The glaziers didn't know about nanoparticles. They knew that adding gold in a certain way produced beautiful red glass, so they did it. You think about how many discoveries hide in plain sight. Their mechanisms unknown to their makers, but their results highly valued. The medieval glazier who figured out how to make ruby glass probably experimented with various additives and heating schedules, keeping careful mental notes about what worked. The knowledge was passed through apprenticeship, master to student, with the understanding, heat it this long, add gold like this, and you'll get this colour. The underlying physics went undiscovered for centuries. Moving along the storage shelves, you find a chunk of ancient glass from Mesopotamia, roughly 4,000 years old. It's opaque blue, coloured with copper compounds, but under certain lighting conditions it shows an internal structure that suggests the glassmaker understood something about controlled cooling rates and crystallization. Cooling molten glass too quickly makes it brittle. Cooling it too slowly allows large crystals to form, making it cloudy. Somewhere in between lies the sweet spot for strong clear glass. Mesopotamian glassmakers found that sweet spot through experience, producing glass that survived 4 millennia. The shelf also holds a peculiar bronze implement from ancient Egypt, a tool whose purpose archaeologists debated for years. The shape suggested various uses: surgical instrument, cosmetic applicator, and specialized craft tool. Eventually someone noticed that the bronze had an unusual composition for Egyptian work, with higher tin content than typical. This made it springier and less prone to permanent deformation. Testing revealed that the tool functioned like a precision spring clamp, holding small objects steady during delicate work. Someone engineered an alloy for specific mechanical properties without benefit of metallurgical theory. You pick up a small vial containing purple dye extracted from ancient cloth fragments. This is Tyrian purple, the famous dye made from sea snails by ancient Phoenician dyers. Producing 1 gram of this dye required processing thousands of snails. The exact process involved extracting specific glands, combining the secretions from multiple snail species, and exposing the mixture to sunlight while controlling pH. Getting it wrong meant worthless brown sludge. Getting it right meant a colour-fast purple dye worth more than gold. The dye makers developed this complex biochemical process through observation and experimentation, without understanding enzymes or chemical structures. A nearby box contains fragments of ancient Indian woot steel, the source material for Damascus blades. You examine the metal under magnification, seeing the characteristic patterns that mark it as high-quality steel. But analysis shows something unexpected. The carbon content varies in precise patterns throughout the metal structure. This isn't random distribution, but organized segregation at microscales. Somehow, the Indian steelmakers' heating and cooling processes created predictable internal structures that modern metallurgy recognizes as quite sophisticated. The artifacts keep revealing surprises. A Roman glass vessel shows color-changing properties, appearing green in reflected light but red when light shines through it. The effect comes from gold and silver nanoparticles suspended in the glass matrix, nanotechnology created by people who had no concept of nanoscale engineering. They just knew that adding certain materials in certain ways produced dramatic optical effects. You examine a piece of ancient concrete from an aqueduct, noting how the aggregate is carefully graded. Larger stones at the bottom, smaller toward the top. This improved the concrete's strength and durability, matching principles that modern engineers recognise as sound practice. The ancient builders didn't have structural engineering textbooks. They observed that graduated aggregate worked better and used that knowledge. A small bronze gear from an ancient mechanism shows surprisingly accurate tooth spacing. Someone cut those teeth using hand tools and careful measurement, achieving precision that modern machinists would need specialised equipment to match. The gear represents hours of patient work by a craftsperson whose name we'll never know, creating a component for some larger device that's long since vanished. Each artifact tells a story of a knowledge developed through observation and refined through practice. The makers didn't need scientific theories to create effective solutions. They needed careful attention to materials and processes, willingness to experiment, and a good memory for what worked and what didn't. This practical knowledge allowed them to achieve results that still impress modern experts working with advanced analytical tools. You think about the disconnect between theoretical understanding and practical capability. Modern scientists can explain why ruby glass gets its colour from gold nanoparticles, but that explanation doesn't automatically make you able to produce beautiful red glass. The medieval glazier couldn't explain the mechanism, but could consistently create the desired result. Sometimes practical mastery precedes theoretical understanding by centuries. You're sitting in a modern research laboratory, watching scientists analyse ancient artefacts using equipment that would seem like magic to the original makers. Electron microscopes reveal structures invisible to the human eye. Mass spectrometers identify elements present in parts per million. X-ray diffraction maps crystalline structures. Computer simulations model stress and strain distributions. Despite all this analytical power, definitive answers remain elusive. The scientist at the next bench is studying samples from Roman concrete, trying to understand exactly how the material achieves its remarkable durability. She's identified most of the chemical reactions involved. She understands the role of volcanic ash and seawater. She can describe the crystalline structures that form over time. But when her team tries to recreate Roman concrete using this knowledge, the results come close, but don't quite match the 2,000-year-old original. This happens repeatedly across different ancient technologies. Modern researchers understand more than ancient craftspeople did about the underlying mechanisms, yet the ancients sometimes achieved results that remain difficult to replicate. The disconnect suggests that practical knowledge and theoretical understanding don't perfectly overlap. You can understand the physics without mastering the craft, or master the craft without understanding the physics. You think about the pyramid builders, who achieved incredible precision without theodolites or laser levels. They couldn't have explained force vectors or structural load distribution using modern engineering vocabulary. But they clearly understood these concepts at an intuitive level, gained through observation and experience. Their knowledge was embodied in practice rather than codified in theory. The research scientist examining Damascus steel fragments faces similar puzzles. Modern metallurgy provides detailed understanding of how carbon and trace elements influence steel's properties. Electron microscopy reveals the internal structures that create the famous patterns. Yet attempts to recreate Damascus steel using modern equipment produce similar looking but not quite identical results. Something about the ancient process, perhaps the variation in temperature during forging, or the specific cooling rates, or subtle differences in trace element ratios, created properties that remain difficult to precisely reproduce. This doesn't mean ancient people had secret knowledge or lost wisdom. It suggests they developed practical expertise through methods different from modern scientific approaches. They worked through iteration and refinement, keeping what worked and discarding what didn't. Generations of craftspeople accumulated knowledge, each adding small improvements. The process produced sophisticated results without requiring theoretical understanding. You watch someone attempt to cut stone using replica copper tools and sand abrasives. The technique works, stone gets cut and surfaces get smoothed. But achieving the precision seen in ancient Egyptian work requires practice, patience, and attention to subtle feedback that only comes through experience. The researcher has read every available source on ancient stoneworking techniques. He's analysed tool marks under magnification. He understands the theory. But his hands don't yet know what the ancient stonecutter's hands knew after years of daily practice. Modern culture tends to privilege theoretical knowledge over practical skill. We write down explanations, create models, and derive equations. This approach produces powerful results and allows rapid transmission of ideas. But some knowledge resists codification. Try writing detailed instructions for riding a bicycle, explaining balance, steering, and pedaling coordination in a way that would let someone who'd never seen a bicycle learn to ride one. The task proves surprisingly difficult. Some knowledge lives in practice motion rather than written description. Ancient craftspeople passed their skills through demonstration and apprenticeship. The apprentice watched the master work, attempted similar tasks under supervision, and gradually developed a feel for the materials and processes. This transmission method kept the knowledge alive as long as the craft tradition continued. But when that tradition broke, whether through economic changes, political disruption, or shifts in demand, the practical knowledge could vanish quickly, even if written descriptions survived. You examine a stack of ancient technical texts, noting how vague they often are about crucial details. A Roman author describes making concrete but doesn't specify exact proportions or explain how to judge when the mixture is ready. He assumes the reader already knows these basics through practical experience. The text serves as a reminder and reference, not as a complete instruction manual. This makes sense for contemporary readers, but frustrates modern researchers trying to recreate ancient techniques from textual sources alone. The mystery of ancient innovations isn't really about lost secrets or forgotten super science. It's about the difference between knowing how and knowing that, between practical mastery and theoretical understanding. Ancient craftspeople knew how to achieve specific results without necessarily knowing why those methods worked. Modern researchers often know why things work without having mastered the practical skills to actually do them. This suggests humility about both ancient capabilities and modern knowledge. Ancient people weren't primitive. They were fully capable humans solving problems with available resources. Their solutions sometimes show sophistication that challenges assumptions about technological progress. At the same time, modern analytical tools provide genuine insights that ancient craftspeople lacked. Neither perspective is complete without the other. You watch concrete slowly gaining strength in a test cylinder, thinking about the Roman harbour at Portus, still standing after 2 millennia. The ancient builders couldn't have written equations describing the chemical reactions strengthening their concrete. They knew that certain mixtures, properly prepared, produced durable structures. That knowledge sufficed for the task at hand. The scientist working on Damascus steel carefully heats a sample in a controlled furnace, monitoring temperature with precision instruments. She's attempting to recreate the exact thermal history that Indian smiths produced in their crucibles through empirical methods. Her approach seems backwards, using advanced equipment to recreate results that were originally achieved with simple tools. But the scientific method requires understanding mechanisms, not just copying techniques. Perhaps the real lesson isn't about any particular lost technology, but about respecting multiple ways of knowing. Practical experience generates knowledge that scientific analysis enriches but doesn't completely replace. The pyramid builder's eye judging whether a stone is level contributes something different from the surveyor's transit reading of exact angles. Both approaches have value. Both produce knowledge. You step outside the laboratory as day fades to evening. The ancient world and modern world feel less distant than usual tonight. People in both eras observe, experiment, refine techniques, and create solutions to problems. The tools differ, the theoretical frameworks differ, but the underlying human capacities remain constant. given sufficient motivation and opportunity, people figure things out. The unsolved mysteries of ancient innovations might eventually yield to persistent research, or some might remain puzzles, reminders that human knowledge is always partial and provisional. Either way, the ancient artifacts themselves endure, concrete standing in seawater, pyramids aligned to true north, glass containing accidental nanotechnology, proof that clever people have always found ways to accomplish impressive things with whatever resources their world provided. There is a kind of silence that only exists before the world starts writing things down. Not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of nothing happening. It is the silence of everything happening quietly, without leaving a mark on paper. It is the silence of 1,000 generations of people who lived full lives, built communities, loved each other, argued about the weather, buried their dead, and celebrated the return of spring, all of which left almost no written record. This is where our story begins, not with a dramatic event, not with a war or a conquest or the fall of a great city. It begins with that silence, with the long, slow, unhurried stretch of time before someone decided that thoughts needed to be pinned down with ink. And here is the thing that most people do not realise, the thing that makes this entire story so quietly extraordinary, that silence was not an accident. It was not a failure. It was not a sign that these people had nothing worth saying. It was a choice. A deliberate, careful, deeply considered choice made by some of the most thoughtful people who ever lived on this earth. And once you understand why they made that choice, once you truly sit with the reasoning behind it, the entire history of the ancient Celts begins to look less like a mystery and more like something that was always there, waiting to be understood on its terms rather than on ours. So settle in. Let the night come around you. Let the sounds of the world outside grow quiet and distant. We're going to move through this story slowly, the way these ancient people themselves moved through the world, with attention, with care, and with a great deal of patience. Imagine the landscape of Europe roughly 2,500 years ago. Not the Europe of highways and city grids and satellite maps, but the older Europe. The Europe of dense forest and open meadow, of rivers that had not yet been dammed or straightened, of hills that rose and fell in long, unbroken waves of green. The air was different then, cleaner in ways we can barely comprehend now. The stars at night were a blaze of white across a sky that no electric light had ever interrupted. The people who lived across this landscape, stretching from what we now call Ireland all the way east, to the plains of modern-day Turkey and south into the warmth of the Iberian Peninsula, were not one single nation. They did not call themselves Celts. That word came later, applied by Greek and Roman writers who were trying to make sense of peoples they did not fully understand. But these scattered communities shared something remarkable. They shared a way of seeing the world, a common thread of language, of belief, and of social organisation tied them together across thousands of miles of varied terrain. And the first thing you need to understand about them, the very first thing, is that they were not backward. They were not primitive. They were not a lesser version of the Greeks and Romans who wrote about them. They were simply different, profoundly, intentionally different. And that difference is at the heart of everything we're going to talk about tonight. The Greeks and Romans, for all their extraordinary achievements in philosophy and engineering and law, were cultures that believed in writing things down. They believed that knowledge lived on paper, that if something was not recorded, it was somehow less real, less permanent, and less worthy of being remembered. This was their lens, and it was the lens through which they looked at every other civilization they encountered. When they looked at the Celts, they saw a people with no books, no written histories, no libraries. And through their particular lens, this looked like absence. It looked like lack. It looked like people who had nothing to say or who had not yet figured out how to say it. But what if it was the opposite? What if the Celts looked at the Greek and Roman obsession with writing and saw something dangerous, something that could weaken the mind rather than strengthen it? What if their silence, their beautiful and deliberate silence, was actually one of the most sophisticated intellectual decisions any ancient civilization ever made. Let us sit with that idea for a moment. Let it settle. Close your eyes for a moment if you like. Not to sleep, not yet, but simply to imagine what it would have felt like to live in a world without books, without newspapers, without the constant murmur of written language surrounding you at every turn. A world where the only way to learn something was to find someone who already knew it, and to sit with them and to listen. A world where knowledge had a voice, a breath, and a warmth, where it could only be given from one living person to another, the way a flame can only be passed from one candle to the next. That world was not so long ago, in the deep measure of human time. And for the Celts, it was not simply the world they happened to live in. It was the world they actively chose to preserve. The Greeks had a word for it. They called the Celts' way of passing knowledge through spoken language and memorized verse and oral tradition. And they recorded this, because of course they did, with a mixture of fascination and something close to bemusement. The historian Strabo wrote about Celtic scholars who spent years, sometimes as many as 19 years, in a state of study that was almost monastic in its dedication. Julius Caesar himself, in his accounts of his campaigns in what is now France, noted that the Celtic priests, the people we have come to call Druids, refused to commit their teachings to writing even though they were perfectly capable of it. This is a crucial detail. Caesar did not say the Celts could not write. He said they chose not to. There is a world of difference between those two statements, and most people, when they first encounter this history, gloss right past it. So why? Why would an intelligent, sophisticated people deliberately refuse to write down their most important knowledge? The answer, when you begin to piece it together from the scattered references left by Greek and Roman writers, and from the archaeological evidence, and from the deep wells of Celtic myth and poetry that survived in Ireland and Wales in later centuries, is both practical and philosophical. It touches on questions about how memory works, about the relationship between a person and the land they live on, and about what happens to knowledge when you remove it from the living context in which it was meant to exist. The first reason was about the nature of memory itself. The Celts, and many other cultures around the world who practiced oral tradition, understood something about the human mind that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to confirm. They understood that knowledge that is memorized through repetition, through rhythm, through song, or through story is not stored the same way as knowledge that is simply read from a page. Memorized knowledge becomes part of you. It lives in your body as much as it lives in your mind. It is connected to emotion, to breath, and to the act of speaking aloud to another person. It is alive in a way that words on a page are not. When a Celtic scholar spent 19 years memorizing the teachings of their tradition, they were not simply filling up a mental library. They were transforming themselves. The knowledge was becoming woven into the fabric of their consciousness, inseparable from who they were. And this meant that every time the knowledge was passed on from teacher to student, from elder to young person, from one generation to the next, it was not a copying process. It was a living transmission, a conversation, a relationship. The poetry of the ancient Celts deserves a moment of its own, because it was not simply a form of entertainment or even a form of cultural preservation. It was, in a very real sense, a technology, a sophisticated, carefully developed set of techniques for encoding information in a form that the human memory could hold onto across generations without losing its essential content. Celtic verse forms were extraordinarily complex. The Irish poets, the Philid, as they were called, were required to master dozens of different meter patterns before they were considered fully trained. These patterns were not arbitrary. They were designed to work with the way the human mind naturally processes and retains rhythmic information. A piece of knowledge encoded in a particular meter, sung or chanted to a particular melody, and repeated at regular intervals over the course of years. That knowledge would take root in the memory in a way that a simple statement of fact never could. Think of how easily you remember a song you heard as a child, how the words come back to you, decades later, unbidden, triggered by a particular melody or a particular rhythm. The Celts understood this capacity of the human mind, and they built their entire system of knowledge transmission around it. The great poems, the origin myths, the genealogies, the histories of the gods and the heroes were not simply stories told for pleasure. They were repositories. Living libraries were carried in the minds of the poets who had memorized them and passed on, intact, from one generation of poets to the next. The discipline required to become a Celtic poet was immense. The training lasted years. Some accounts say as many as 12 or even 20 years of intensive study. The student learned not only the verse forms and the melodies, but also the entire body of knowledge that the poems contained. Geography, history, law, genealogy, the names and deeds of every significant figure in the community's past, the relationships between places and people and events that gave meaning to the present, all of it woven into verse, carried in memory, ready to be spoken aloud when the occasion demanded it. This was not a lesser form of intellectual achievement than writing. It was a different form, and in some ways, in the way it demanded total engagement, in the way it kept knowledge alive and responsive to the community that used it, and in the way it maintained a living relationship between the knowledge and the people who carried it, it was arguably a more powerful form. A book can be ignored, a poem that lives in a poet's memory, that will be spoken aloud at the next gathering, that the entire community expects to hear, that knowledge cannot be set aside. It must be attended to. It must be received. Write something down, and it becomes a thing you can point to. A fixed object. Something that can be copied, carried away, stripped of its context, and misunderstood by someone who was never meant to receive it. Keep it in memory. Keep it alive through the act of telling and listening, and it remains tethered to the people and the places and the relationships that gave it meaning. This was not a small consideration. For cultures whose entire worldview was built around the idea that the land, the seasons, the community, and the individual were all part of one continuous breathing system, the idea of knowledge floating free, disconnected from all of that, pinned to a piece of parchment like a butterfly pinned to a board, that would have seemed not just strange but almost violent. And this brings us to the landscapes. If you could fly over ancient Celtic territory in the early morning light, let us say sometime around 500 BCE, when their influence stretched widest across the continent, you would notice something. You would notice that the places where these communities built their most important gathering sites, their sacred spaces, and their places of ceremony and council were not chosen randomly. They were not simply wherever it was convenient to build. They were chosen with extraordinary care, and the criteria for that choice had almost nothing to do with military strategy or trade routes. The Celts chose their sacred landscapes the way a musician chooses a resonant room. They listened to the land. There are places in the world where something seems to happen to the quality of your attention, where the light falls in a particular way, or where the land curves into a shape that makes you stop walking and simply stand there breathing, where water moves over stone in a way that sounds almost like language, where the boundary between sky and earth seems thinner than it does anywhere else. The Celts were extraordinarily sensitive to these places. They found them, and they marked them, and they returned to them generation after generation. Many of these places share certain physical characteristics. They tend to be at points where different landscapes meet, where a forest gives way to open water, where a hilltop drops suddenly into a valley, or where a river bends sharply and creates an island or a peninsula. These are liminal places, threshold places, places where one world seems to bleed into another, and the Celts understood, or perhaps more accurately the Celts felt, that these transitions in the landscape were meaningful, that they corresponded to something real about the nature of the world. The bogs were particularly important, across Ireland, Scotland, Britain, and into the heartlands of continental Celtic territory in France and Germany. The great peat bogs were treated as sacred ground, and not sacred in the way we might casually use that word today, meaning simply important, or impressive. Sacred in the sense that they were understood to be a place where the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond it became extraordinarily thin. Think about what a bog actually is if you've never stood at the edge of one in the early morning when the mist is sitting low on the water. It is a landscape that is neither land nor water. It is solid enough to walk on, but only just. Beneath your feet, the ground is a sponge of decomposed plant matter and dark, tea-coloured water that stretches down into depths you cannot see. The surface moves when you step on it. It trembles. Things that fall into a bog do not disappear. They are preserved. Extraordinarily well preserved, in fact, sometimes for thousands of years. The bog holds what is given to it. The bog bodies themselves, and there are hundreds of them found across Ireland, Britain, Denmark, Germany and the Netherlands, are among the most haunting and most informative artefacts the ancient world has left behind. Preserved by the acidic, oxygen-poor conditions of the peat, some of them are so well preserved that you can see the texture of their skin, the contents of their last meal, and the calluses on their hands from years of work. They are, in a sense, the closest we can come to looking at an ancient Celtic person face to face. For decades, the popular narrative surrounding bog bodies focused on violence. Many of them show signs of brutal treatment, stab wounds, broken bones, and ligature marks around the neck. This led to dramatic theories about ritual sacrifice, about offerings to the gods, and about the dark and bloody side of Celtic religion that the Romans had warned us about. And the Romans, of course, were only too happy to have their accounts seemingly confirmed. But more recent scholarship has complicated this picture enormously. Many bog bodies show no signs of violence at all. They are simply people who died, from illness, from accident, from the ordinary causes that have always ended human lives, and whose bodies were placed in the bog with care, with attention, sometimes with grave goods, a cloak, a knife, a piece of food, sometimes with injuries that appear to have been treated and healed over, before death came from some other cause entirely. And even the violent deaths, when examined more carefully, do not always support the narrative of brutal ritual killing. Some scholars have suggested that bog bodies may represent a complex range of burial practices, some honourable, some punitive, some somewhere in between, that reflect the full spectrum of how a Celtic community dealt with its dead. The bog was not simply a place of sacrifice. It was a place of transition, a place where the dead were given to the land, returned to the earth in a way that acknowledged the cycle of decay and renewal that the bog itself so perfectly represented. To stand at the edge of a bog and to think about what lies beneath the surface, the layers of compressed vegetation, the slow accumulation of centuries, the bodies and the offerings and the memories of all the people who came here to give something back to the land, is to stand at one of the most profound interfaces between human life and the natural world that exists anywhere on Earth. The bog does not judge. It does not distinguish between the honourable dead and the dishonoured. It simply receives. It simply preserves. It holds what is given to it, and it holds it gently, and it holds it for as long as it needs to. The Celts knew this, and they gave the dogs many things. Weapons, yes, and sometimes bodies. Though the violence sometimes attributed to bog bodies is far more complicated than popular accounts suggest, and we'll come back to that. But also treasures, gold torques and intricate bronze work and beautifully crafted cauldrons that represented enormous wealth and skill. These were not things discarded or lost. They were offerings, gifts given to a place that was understood to exist between worlds. And here is where the conspiracy begins to reveal itself, not as something sinister, but as something quietly magnificent. Because the Romans, when they encountered these sacred landscapes, did not understand them. They could not understand them. Not really, because their entire framework for thinking about the world did not include the possibility that a landscape could be sacred in itself, independent of any god or temple built upon it. The Romans built temples, they placed statues, they imposed their gods onto the land like stamps pressed into wax. The idea that the land itself might already be holy might already possess a kind of consciousness or significance that predated any human religion. That was a foreign concept. And so when Roman writers described Celtic sacred sites, they described them in Roman terms. They saw ritual, and they called it superstition. They saw reverence, and they called it fear. They saw a complex, nuanced relationship between a people and their landscape, and they simplified it into something they could fit into their own understanding. And the simplification stuck. For centuries, for well over 1,000 years, the story of the Celts was told through Roman eyes. Their sacred landscapes became primitive ritual grounds. Their careful, deliberate relationship with the land became barbaric nature worship. Their silence, their beautiful oral tradition, became evidence of backwardness. But the landscape itself did not change. The bogs are still there. The hilltops are still there. The places where water meets stone in that particular way, where the light does that particular thing in the early morning, those places are still there, and they still do something to the people who visit them. They still make you stop. They still make you breathe a little deeper. They still feel, to anyone who is paying attention, like a place where something important is happening, just below the surface of what you can see. Let the night settle a little deeper around you now. We are moving into the quieter heart of this story. Power. Let us talk about power, because this is where another one of the great Celtic conspiracies, another one of the things that Roman writers got so fundamentally wrong, truly comes into focus. When most people think about ancient societies, they think about kings. They think about pyramids of authority, with one person at the top and everyone else below. This is such a deeply ingrained assumption in Western thinking that we often project it onto cultures where it did not actually exist. We assume that every ancient society had a single ruler, a supreme leader, someone who held all the power and made all the decisions. And when we look at the Celts, we look for that person. We look for the king, the chief, the supreme authority. But the picture that emerges when you look carefully at the evidence, not just the Roman accounts, but the Irish and Welsh myths that preserve so much of Celtic social structure, and the archaeological record of how Celtic communities actually lived, the picture is much more interesting than a simple hierarchy. Much more interesting and much more subtle. Celtic society was, in many ways, a society built on negotiation, on consensus, on a web of relationships and obligations that distributed power so thoroughly that no single person could ever accumulate too much of it without the whole web beginning to vibrate in protest. The Irish myths, and these myths, though written down in the early medieval period by Christian monks, preserve remarkably detailed information about pre-Christian Irish social customs, are full of kings who are not really kings in the way we understand the word. They are figures who hold a particular role, yes, but that role is bounded by obligations so extensive and so carefully defined that it functions almost as much as a form of service as it does as a form of authority. There is the concept of the sacred king, the king whose personal well-being is tied to the prosperity of the land. If the king is virtuous, the crops grow well. If the king fails in his duties, the land itself begins to wither. This is not simply a metaphor in the myths. It is presented as a literal physical truth. The king is not above the land. He is part of it. His power does not come from conquest or wealth or military force. It comes from his relationship with the earth, and that relationship can be broken. And there are rules, so many rules. The Irish myths are full of what are called geasa, singular gaze, which are essentially sacred prohibitions placed on individuals, often on kings. A king might be forbidden from eating a particular food, or from travelling in a particular direction on a particular day, or from refusing hospitality to a stranger. These prohibitions might seem arbitrary to a modern reader, but they functioned as a kind of check on power. They reminded the person who held authority that their authority was conditional, that it could be taken away, that they were answerable not just to their community, but to the land itself, and to the deep, old, invisible forces that the land represented. This is not the picture of power that the Romans painted. The Romans saw Celtic warriors and Celtic leaders, and they saw something that looked, to Roman eyes, like a familiar structure. a chieftain with warriors beneath him, like a rougher, less civilized version of a Roman general. They did not see, or if they saw, they did not understand the vast invisible architecture of obligation and reciprocity and sacred duty that actually held Celtic society together. And because the Romans did not see it, they did not write about it. And because they did not write about it, it disappeared from the historical record. For centuries, the Celtic world looked, to anyone reading the available sources, like a collection of warlike tribes ruled by ambitious chieftains, simple, brutal, easily understood through a Roman lens. But the myth survived, passed down at first through exactly the kind of oral tradition the Celts had always relied on, and then eventually written down by monks in Ireland who were trying to preserve something they sensed was valuable, even if they no longer fully understood its original context. And when scholars began to read those myths carefully, really carefully, paying attention not just to the dramatic stories but to the social details embedded within them, they began to see the shape of a society that was far more sophisticated, far more thoughtful in its organisation than anyone had given it credit for. Power shared, not hoarded, not concentrated, distributed through a web of relationships so intricate and so carefully maintained that it looked, from the outside, almost invisible, almost like no one was in charge at all. But everyone was. Everyone, in their own way, in their own sphere, held a piece of it, and the system worked, quietly, sustainably, without the constant upheaval that comes when power is held by too few hands. Now, the Romans. We cannot tell this story without spending some time with the Romans, because it was the Romans who did more than anyone else to shape the way we think about the Celts. And what they did, unintentionally for the most part, was to replace a complex, layered reality with a much simpler story. A story that served Roman purposes, even if those purposes were not always consciously articulated. Julius Caesar invaded what is now France, which the Romans called Gaul, in 58 BCE. It was an extraordinarily bloody campaign, and the Romans won, and when it was over, Caesar wrote about it. His writings, the Gallic Wars, are one of our primary sources for understanding the Celts of that era. And they are fascinating documents, partly because Caesar was a genuinely brilliant observer, and partly because he was also a politician with a very specific audience in mind. He was writing for Rome. He was writing to justify his campaigns, to demonstrate his military genius, and to present the peoples he had conquered in a way that made his conquest seem necessary and impressive. To do that, he needed the Celts to be a certain kind of enemy, brave enough to be worthy opponents. Caesar was not interested in boasting about defeating a rabble, but also different enough, strange enough, that conquering them seemed like a civilizing act, a bringing of order to chaos, a bringing of light to darkness. So Caesar wrote about Celtic human sacrifice. He wrote about the Druids burning people alive inside giant wicker structures shaped like men, the famous wicker man. He wrote about society that was, in his telling, simultaneously impressive and horrifying, sophisticated enough to have priests and philosophers, but savage enough to demand blood. Now, how much of this was true? The honest answer is we do not know for certain. Caesar was not the only Roman writer to describe Celtic rituals, and there is some consistency across sources about certain practices. But there is also a very well-established pattern, documented by scholars who have studied this question carefully, of Roman writers borrowing descriptions from one another, embellishing details, and filtering everything through a lens that made Celtic practices look as alien and frightening as possible. The wicker man, for instance. Caesar describes it. Other writers repeat the description, but no one has ever found archaeological evidence of a wicker man structure being used for mass burning. What archaeologists have found in bog deposits and ritual sites across Celtic territory is something much more nuanced. Offerings. Sacrifices, yes, in some cases, but sacrifice understood in a very different way than the Romans presented it. Not as a spectacle of horror, but as an exchange. a gift given to the land, to the gods, to the invisible forces that sustained life, a gift that was sometimes, tragically, a human life, but embedded in a context of meaning and relationship that the Roman accounts strip away entirely. This is what happens when one civilization writes the history of another. The details that matter most to the people living the experience, the meaning, the context, the web of belief and obligation that surrounds any act, those details are the first things to be lost. What remains is the surface, the dramatic image, the thing that can be understood quickly and used to support a particular narrative. And the narrative the Romans built around the Celts was remarkably durable. It lasted for centuries. It shaped how medieval European scholars thought about the pre-Roman peoples of their continent. It shaped how Renaissance writers imagined the ancient world. It shaped, to a degree that is only now beginning to be fully understood, how we think about the Celts today. But here is the thing about durable narratives. They are durable precisely because they are simple. And simple stories, no matter how well told, always leave something out. The Romans left out the oral tradition. They left out the sacred landscapes. They left out the subtle architecture of shared power. They left out the philosophy. They left out the poetry. They left out everything that could not be seen from the outside, everything that lived in the silence between words, and everything that required years of patient listening to understand. They left out, in other words, almost everything that mattered most. Let the breath come slow now. We're moving into the deepest part of the story, the part where the threads begin to come together. Truth preserved through memory, through myth, through the long, patient act of telling and retelling, generation after generation, until the stories become so worn smooth by repetition that they feel less like stories and more like the shape of the world itself. This is what happened to Celtic knowledge after the Roman conquest. It did not disappear. It did not vanish into oblivion. It went underground. It went into the stories. It went into the poems and the songs and the seasonal rituals that communities continued to practice long after the Romans had built their roads and their forts and their temples across Celtic territory. The Romans could conquer the land. They could tax the people. They could impose their language, their laws, and their gods. But they could not reach into the memory of an elder sitting by a fire on a winter evening, telling a story to the children gathered around her. They could not silence the songs that were sung at the turning points of the year, at the moments when the sun reached its lowest point, or the harvest came in, or the first frost touched the fields. They could not erase the deep embodied knowledge that Celtic communities carried in their bodies, in their hands, and in their understanding of the land they lived on. And so, the knowledge survived, changed certainly, adapted undoubtedly, mixed with Roman customs and later with Christian beliefs as centuries passed, but surviving, persisting, holding its shape in the way that water holds its shape, flowing around obstacles, finding new channels, but never losing its essential nature. The Irish myths are perhaps the most extraordinary example of this survival. Written down beginning in the 7th and 8th centuries CE by monks in Irish monasteries, these myths preserve stories that scholars believe originated centuries earlier, some of them possibly in the pre-Roman period, carried forward through exactly the kind of oral tradition the Celts had always practiced. The monks who wrote them down did not always understand what they were preserving. They added Christian framing, reinterpreted pagan figures as historical kings, and softened some of the stranger and more unsettling elements. But the bones of the stories remained. The deep structure, the assumptions about how the world worked, about the relationship between people and land, and about the nature of power and obligation and the sacred. And when scholars began to read these myths not as simple entertainment, not as quaint folk tales, but as encoded repositories of an entire civilization's understanding of itself, that is when the real work of rediscovery began. Consider the Tuatha De Danann, one of the great mythological races in Irish tradition. They are described as beings of extraordinary beauty and power who came to Ireland in the distant past, bringing with them 4 treasures: a spear, a sword, a stone, and a cauldron. They ruled Ireland for a time before being displaced by another group, the Milesians, who are understood to represent the arrival of the historical Irish. But the Tuatha Dé Danann did not leave Ireland when they were displaced. They retreated into the hills, into the hollow mountains, into the fairy mounds, the Sid, which are in many cases real places in the Irish landscape. Real hills, real burial mounds, and real ancient sites that still exist today. Now, a modern scholar reading this myth casually might see a simple displacement narrative. One group arrives, another group leaves. The departing group becomes supernatural beings who live beneath the earth. Straightforward enough. But read it more carefully. Pay attention to the details. The Tuatha Dé Danann did not really leave. They went beneath the surface. They are still there, in the hills, in the land itself. And the myths are full of moments where the boundary between their world and the human world becomes permeable. At certain times of year, particularly at Samhain, the festival at the end of October that marked the Celtic New Year, the doors of the Sid open and the Tuatha Dé Danann can be seen. They can interact with humans. The worlds overlap. What is this, if not a mythological expression of the Celtic understanding that the land is alive, that the landscape contains layers of meaning and presence that go deeper than what the human eye can see, that the relationship between a people and their territory is not simply a matter of living on the land, but of living with it, alongside it, in a continuous conversation that spans generations and crosses boundaries that we, in our modern, rational framework, have convinced ourselves do not exist. The four treasures of the Tuatha Dé Danann have been the subject of scholarly analysis for over a century. Some researchers have connected them to ritual objects found in archaeological digs across Celtic territory. The cauldron in particular appears again and again in Celtic contexts, a vessel of abundance, of transformation, of communal gathering. The famous cauldron of Dagda, belonging to one of the great gods of Irish myth, is described as never being empty, as feeding the hungry, and as being large enough to hold the entire world. This is not simply a fairy tale detail. It is an expression of a value, a belief that abundance is not something to be hoarded, but something to be shared, that the purpose of power, of any kind of power, whether it belongs to a god or a king or a community, is to nourish. And this brings us back to the question of power, back to the quiet conspiracy at the heart of Celtic civilization. The conspiracy that was never really a conspiracy at all, but simply a way of organising human life that the Romans did not understand, and that our own civilization, with its emphasis on individual achievement and centralised authority, has largely forgotten. The night is deepening now. Let the words come to you like water, like the slow movement of a stream over smooth stones. There is no urgency here, no rush. The story will unfold at its own pace, the way it always has, the way it was always meant to. There is a place in County Clare, on the west coast of Ireland, called the Burren. It is one of the strangest landscapes in Europe. The ground is made almost entirely of limestone, pale grey and fractured into a maze of cracks and crevices called grikes, and between the grikes, in the thin soil that collects there, extraordinary flowers grow. Arctic plants and alpine plants and Mediterranean plants, all growing side by side because the microclimate created by the limestone is so unusual that species that would normally be separated by thousands of miles of latitude find themselves neighbours here. The Burren has been inhabited for a very long time, longer than most people realise. There are megalithic tombs here that date back over 5,000 years. Great stone structures built by people whose names we will never know, for purposes we can only guess at. And there are traces, in the landscape itself, of a relationship between humans and this strange, beautiful, inhospitable place that goes back even further than that. The Romans barely touched the Burren. It was too remote, too rocky, and too strange to bother conquering. And so it was left largely alone. And the people who lived there continued to live there in ways that had not changed enormously in a very long time. They continued to know the land the way their ancestors had known it, not as a map, not as a resource to be exploited, but as a living system of which they were a part. Walk through the Burren today in the early morning, when the light is coming in low and golden from the west, and you can feel something of what the Celts must have felt when they stood in their sacred places, a sense of being watched, not by anything hostile or frightening, but by something ancient and patient and vast, a sense that the land is aware of you in its own slow geological way, that it has been watching people walk across it for millennia, and that it will continue to watch long after you're gone. This is not mysticism, or rather it is mysticism only if you define mysticism as any experience that falls outside the narrow range of what modern Western rationality considers acceptable. The Celts would not have called it mysticism. They would have called it paying attention. They would have called it being present in a place, really present, with all your senses open and your assumptions quiet. And this is perhaps the deepest truth that the Celtic conspiracies reveal. The deepest thing that was always there, waiting to be understood, beneath the layers of Roman misinterpretation and centuries of cultural amnesia. The conspiracy was never about secrecy. It was about attention. Let us talk about the Druids one more time before we move on, because they deserve more than the caricature that history has handed them. The word Druid itself is debated among scholars. One common interpretation connects it to the Celtic words for oak and knowledge, suggesting something like oak knowledge, or wisdom of the oak. This may or may not be etymologically accurate, but it captures something true about the role these figures played in Celtic society. They were not priests in the way Romans understood priests. They were not simply intermediaries between gods and people, performing rituals in designated sacred spaces. They were scholars, teachers, judges, philosophers, healers, counsellors. The Romans, characteristically, tried to fit them into a Roman category and could not quite manage it. Caesar wrote that the Druids believed in the transmigration of souls, that after death the soul moved into a new body, whether human or animal, and began life again. This belief, if accurate, would have had profound implications for how Druids understood their relationship to the natural world. If you might one day inhabit the body of a deer or a fish or a tree, if the boundary between human and non-human was not fixed but fluid, then the idea of treating the natural world as a resource to be used and discarded would seem not just foolish, but genuinely dangerous. You might be destroying something that will one day house a part of yourself. Imagine what this belief would have meant in practice. Imagine walking through a forest and understanding, not as an abstract philosophical idea, but as a felt conviction that the deer watching you from between the trees might one day carry a soul that was once human, that the oak tree above you, ancient and gnarled and patient beyond all human reckoning, might be a resting place for a consciousness that once sat by a fire and told stories and loved someone. This kind of belief does not produce a casual relationship with the natural world. It produces reverence. It produces care. It produces the kind of deep, attentive relationship with the landscape that archaeologists have found traces of everywhere they have looked in Celtic territory. The forests the Celts lived in were not the kind of forests we think of today, managed, thinned, and domesticated by centuries of human intervention. They were old-growth forests, dense and dark and alive with a complexity that modern ecology is only beginning to understand. The canopy was so thick in places that the forest floor was perpetually dim, a world of green shadow and filtered light, where the air was cool and damp and smelled of moss and earth and the slow, patient process of decay that feeds new growth. To move through such a forest was to move through something that felt, unmistakably, alive. Not alive in the way a person is alive, but alive in a deeper, slower, more ancient sense. Alive the way the earth itself is alive. The Celts knew this forest intimately. They knew which plants could heal and which could kill. They knew where the deer gathered in the early morning and where the salmon ran in autumn. They knew the cycles of the seasons with a precision that came not from observation alone, but from generations of accumulated knowledge, passed from parent to child, from elder to apprentice, in exactly the kind of living transmission that their oral tradition was designed to preserve. This is speculative, of course. We cannot know exactly what the Druids believed, because they did not write it down. But the belief in transmigration, combined with the Celtic reverence for sacred landscapes and the deep ecological knowledge that Celtic communities clearly possessed, knowledge of plants, of animals, and of the rhythms of the seasons that goes far beyond what casual observation could provide, all of this suggests a worldview in which humans were not masters of the earth, but participants in it. Not the rulers of nature, but one voice among many in an ongoing conversation. The Romans found this deeply unsettling. A worldview in which humans were not supreme, in which the land had its own authority, and in which power was not concentrated in human hands, but distributed throughout a living system. This challenged something fundamental about the Roman self-understanding. Rome was built on the idea of dominion, of conquest, of imposing human will upon the world. The Celtic way of seeing things, quiet, reciprocal, humble in its recognition of human limitation, was not just foreign to Rome. It was in some sense a rebuke. And so Rome did what empires have always done when they encounter a worldview that threatens their own. They dismissed it. They ridiculed it. They simplified it into something that could be safely ignored or safely conquered. They turned the Druids into exotic curiosities or into frightening witch doctors performing bloody rituals in dark groves. Anything that would make the Celtic worldview seem less like a serious alternative to Roman civilization and more like a quaint primitive aberration. But the Druids disappeared from the historical record not because they ceased to exist, but because the Romans stopped writing about them. After the conquest of Gaul, the Druids were suppressed. Their gatherings were banned, and their authority was undermined by the new Roman administrative structure. But suppression is not the same as destruction. The knowledge they carried did not vanish. It dispersed. It moved into the communities. It became part of the ordinary, everyday understanding that Celtic people carried with them as they went about their lives, growing food, raising animals, marking the seasons, and telling stories to their children by firelight. And centuries later, when scholars began to piece together what Celtic civilization had actually been like, not through the Roman accounts alone, but through the myths, the place names, the archaeological evidence, and the folklore that persisted in rural communities long after the official history had declared the Celts conquered and forgotten, they began to see the outlines of something that had never truly disappeared, something that had simply gone quiet, something that had been there all along, waiting in the silence, waiting in the land, waiting in the stories that grandmothers told their grandchildren on winter evenings when the fire was low and the wind was moving through the darkness outside. There is a phenomenon that linguists call substrate influence. It is the way in which a language that is replaced by another language, through conquest, migration, or cultural pressure, leaves traces of itself in the new language, words, phrases, and ways of expressing certain ideas that the conquering language did not have its own words for. These traces persist for centuries, sometimes millennia, long after the original language has ceased to be spoken. Celtic languages left extraordinary traces across Europe. The place names of Britain, France, and much of continental Europe are thick with Celtic roots. Rivers, hills, forests, towns, the names the Celts gave to these places persisted even after the Celtic languages themselves were replaced by Latin, and then by the various languages that evolved from Latin. The name of Paris comes from a Celtic tribal name. The name of the Rhine may have Celtic origins. Across the British Isles, the majority of ancient place names, the names of rivers especially, are Celtic in origin, predating the arrival of the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Vikings. These names are not simply labels. They are in many cases descriptions. Celtic place names often encode information about the character of a place, its landscape, its water, and its relationship to the surrounding terrain. They are in a sense a map made of language, a way of describing the world that preserves, in compressed and ancient form, the Celtic understanding of how places relate to each other and to the people who live among them. When you walk through the countryside of Wales or Ireland or Scotland, and you pay attention to the place names, the old names, the ones that predate the English language by centuries, you are walking through a landscape that is still, in some small but real way, Celtic. The names are still there. The knowledge encoded in them is still there, though it requires patience and scholarship to decode. The land remembers even when the people have forgotten. The night is very deep now. The world outside is quiet. Let yourself sink a little deeper into the stillness. We are coming to the end of our story, but not to an ending. That is an important distinction. The story of the Celts does not end. It does not conclude with a neat resolution or a final revelation. It simply opens up, like a landscape seen from a hilltop, into a vista that extends further than you can see. But let us stay with it a little longer. Let us follow the thread a little further into the quiet. The rediscovery of Celtic civilization, the slow, patient, painstaking work of scholars and archaeologists and linguists who have spent generations piecing together what Celtic life was actually like. This work is still ongoing. It is far from complete. There are vast gaps in our knowledge, and there probably always will be, because the Celts made a choice thousands of years ago not to write things down. They made a choice that meant their story would have to be reconstructed from fragments, from traces, from the things they left behind in the earth and the things they left behind in the stories that survived. But what has been reconstructed, even in its incomplete form, is enough to overturn some of the oldest and most persistent assumptions about ancient European civilization. It is enough to suggest that the Romans' account of the Celts was not history but propaganda. It is enough to suggest that the silence the Celts chose was not emptiness but fullness. It is enough to suggest that the way these people lived, quietly, attentively, in deep relationship with the land they inhabited, was not a primitive stage on the way to civilization, but a civilization in its own right, a different kind of civilization, one that valued different things, one that measured success not in conquests or monuments or written records, but in the health of the land, the strength of the community, and the depth of the relationship between a people and the place they called home. There is a tradition in Celtic storytelling, preserved in the Irish tales, of a place called Tir na Nog, the land of the young, a place beyond the western sea or beneath the hills, or somewhere just past the edge of the visible world, where time moves differently, where the land is always green, where there is no aging, no decay, no loss, where the people who find their way there live in a kind of eternal golden afternoon. Tir na Nog is not a place you can sail to on a map. It is not a lost continent or a forgotten island. It is, like so many things in Celtic mythology, a way of expressing something that cannot quite be captured in ordinary language. It is the feeling you get when you stand in a place of great beauty and great age, a place like the Burren, or the shores of a lake in the Scottish Highlands, or the ancient oak forests that once covered much of Europe, and you feel for a moment that time has stopped, that you're standing in a pocket of stillness in the midst of a world that is always moving, always changing, always rushing towards something. The Celts understood that feeling, they named it, they built stories around it. They made it part of their understanding of the world, not as an escape from reality, but as a recognition that reality contains more than what we normally see, that beneath the surface of things, beneath the daily rhythms of work and season and community, there is something older and quieter and more enduring, something that has been there since before the first human set foot on this land, and that will be there long after the last one has gone. There are people alive today who have felt something like this. Not in Ireland necessarily, though Ireland holds more of it than almost anywhere else in Europe, but in other places too, in the ancient forests of the Scottish Highlands, where the Caledonian pines stand sparse and weathered and impossibly old against a sky that seems wider than it should be, in the standing stones of Brittany, where great monoliths of granite rise from the earth in rows that stretch for miles, placed there by hands that knew something about the relationship between stone and sky that we have lost entirely. In the chalk hills of southern England, where the landscape is so smooth and so ancient that it seems less like land and more like the surface of a dreaming mind, these are places where time behaves differently, where the present moment seems to thin and something older and larger becomes visible beneath it. The Celts would not have been surprised by this experience. They would have nodded and said, "Yes, that is how it is. That is what the land does when you're quiet enough to notice. This is perhaps the final and deepest Celtic conspiracy. A conspiracy that was never a conspiracy at all. The idea that the world is more than it appears, that the land holds memory, that knowledge can live in places as well as in books. That power does not have to be loud to be real. That silence is not the absence of meaning, but one of its most profound expressions. The Romans built roads across Celtic territory, straight, efficient, purposeful roads that connected the centres of Roman power and made it easier to move armies and goods from one part of the empire to another. These roads are still visible in the landscape today in some places, remarkably well preserved given their age, monuments to Roman engineering and Roman will. But the Celtic paths, the older paths, the ones that wound through the landscape following the contours of the hills, and the courses of the rivers, and the ancient lines of travel between sacred sites. Those paths did not disappear either. They simply went quiet. They became footpaths, then barely visible trails, then nothing at all in most places. But in some places they persisted, in Ireland especially, where Roman conquest was never complete. The old paths continued to be walked, continued to connect the places that mattered, continued to carry people between the sacred sites and the seasonal gathering places and the ancient burial grounds that dotted the landscape like punctuation marks in a very long and very slow sentence. Walk one of these paths today, if you can find one. Walk it slowly, in the early morning or the late afternoon when the light is soft and the world is quiet. Pay attention to where it goes. Pay attention to what it connects. Pay attention to the way it moves through the landscape, not fighting the terrain, not cutting straight through it, but flowing with it, following the natural logic of the hills and the valleys and the water. You are walking on a path that someone walked 3,000 years ago. Someone who understood this land in ways we have only begun to recover. Someone who chose this route not because it was the fastest way from one place to another, but because it was the most meaningful. Because it passed through places that mattered. Because it connected points of significance in a web of relationships that stretched across the entire landscape. The path is still there. The knowledge it represents is still there, encoded in the curve of the route, in the places it touches, and in the way it moves through the world. It has been quiet for a very long time, but it has never stopped being walked. We are nearing the end of our journey tonight, but before we close, let us sit with one more image, one more moment of stillness. Somewhere in the west of Ireland, on a night in late October, thousands of years ago, a community gathered at the edge of a bog. The night was cold, that particular cold that comes in the Celtic twilight, when the last warmth of summer has finally left the air and the first real breath of winter touches your skin. The stars were beginning to appear, one by one, in a sky that was not yet fully dark. A great fire was being built, not for warmth alone, but for ceremony, for the marking of a boundary, the end of one year and the beginning of another. This was Samhain. The festival is at the turning point of the Celtic year, the night when the doors of the Cid opened, and the boundary between the living world and the world of the dead, the world of the ancestors, and the world of the Tuatha De Danann became thin enough to step through. People gathered from across the region, families who had not seen each other since the last great gathering, young people who had come of age over the summer, elders who carried the weight of memory and the responsibility of passing it on. The Druids, or whoever filled that role in this particular community, would have been present, guiding the ceremony, speaking the words that connected this night to all the Samhains that had come before it, stretching back into a past so deep that no single memory could hold it all. The smoke from the fire rose straight up into the still air, a dark column against the stars, carrying with it the scent of burning oak and heather and something older, earthier, the smell of peat that had been laid on the flames deliberately, connecting the fire to the land beneath it, to the bog that stretched away into the darkness beyond the circle of light. The children were quiet now, watching the flames with wide, serious eyes. They understood, even at their young age, that this was not an ordinary night, that something was happening that went beyond the warmth of the fire and the comfort of being gathered together with the people they loved. An elder spoke, not loudly. There was no need for loudness in a group this size, in a silence this complete. She spoke the names of the dead from the past year, each name spoken with care, with attention, with the weight that comes from knowing a person well and mourning their absence. And after each name, a pause, a moment of stillness in which the community collectively held the memory of that person, their face, their voice, their particular way of moving through the world, before letting it settle back into the silence from which it had been called. This was the work of Samhain. Not a celebration exactly, though there was joy in the gathering. Not mourning exactly, though there was grief in the remembering. It was something in between, something that the Celtic understanding of the world made room for in a way that later civilizations, with their sharper divisions between life and death, and between the sacred and the ordinary, would find difficult to accommodate. It was the acknowledgement that the dead were not gone, not entirely, that they were present in the land, in the stories and in the memories of the living, that the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was not a wall but a membrane, permeable, thin enough on certain nights to feel. The fire burned, the stories were told. The names of the dead were spoken aloud so that they would not be forgotten, so that they would know they were remembered, and so that the connection between the living and the dead remained unbroken. Offerings were made to the bog, to the land, and to the invisible presences that the community understood to be part of their world, even though they could not be seen. And then, as the fire burned lower, and the night deepened, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead in their ancient patterns, the community began to disperse, back to their homes, their families, their daily lives, but carrying with them, as they always did, the knowledge that had been spoken and sung and shared that night, carrying it in their memories, in their bodies, in the way they understood the world and their place in it. No one wrote it down. No one needed to. This is how knowledge survives when it is not written on paper, not as a fixed thing, a monument, or a record that can be pointed to and said to be the truth, but as a living thing, moving from person to person, changing slightly with each telling, adapting to new circumstances and new understandings, but holding its essential shape, holding its core meaning, the way a river holds its essential character even as the water in it is constantly changing, constantly flowing through, and constantly being replaced by new water from new rain. The Celts understood this. They understood that knowledge is not a thing to be possessed, but a thing to be participated in. A conversation, not a monologue. A relationship, not a transaction. And they built their entire civilization on that understanding, quietly, patiently, without leaving the kind of dramatic monuments or written records that later civilizations would use to measure and judge them. They left something else instead. They left the land itself marked with the traces of their attention. They left the stories, worn smooth by centuries of retelling but still holding their shape. They left the place names, encoded with information about the character of the landscape. They left the paths, winding through the hills in patterns that reflect a deep understanding of how the world fits together. They left, in short, everything that matters, and nothing that does not. The conspiracies that were actually true. Let us gather them up gently before we let them go. The conspiracy of silence. The deliberate choice not to write. made not out of ignorance but out of a sophisticated understanding of how knowledge works best when it lives in living minds, rather than on dead pages. A choice that looked to the Romans like backwardness, but was actually a form of intellectual courage. A bet that the relationship between teacher and student, between elder and young person, and between story and listener was more valuable than any book. The conspiracy of the landscape, the careful, patient selection of sacred sites based not on military or economic logic, but on a felt sense of the land's own significance. A practice that the Romans dismissed as superstition, but that reflected a genuine and profound relationship between a people and the territory they inhabited. A relationship that was not simply about using the land, but about listening to it. The conspiracy of shared power, the intricate, invisible architecture of obligation and reciprocity that distributed authority so thoroughly that no single person could accumulate too much of it. A system that looked, from the outside, like chaos or the absence of leadership, but was actually one of the most sophisticated forms of social organization ever devised. A system built not on force, but on relationship. Not on conquest, but on consensus. The conspiracy of survival. The way Celtic knowledge persisted through centuries of Roman conquest and Christian conversion, and cultural amnesia, not because it was hidden in secret, but because it was woven into the fabric of daily life, into the stories, into the seasonal rituals, into the names of places and the paths through the hills, and the deep embodied understanding that communities carried with them wherever they went. A survival that looked, to anyone not paying close attention, like disappearance. But it was actually something much more interesting, something much more quiet, something much more enduring. The fire is very low now. The night is at its deepest. Somewhere far away, on the other side of the world, the sun is rising over landscapes that the Celts never knew about. But here, in the darkness, in the stillness, the old knowledge is still present, not as a dramatic revelation, not as a secret finally uncovered after centuries of mystery, but as something that was always there, in the land and in the stories and in the way certain places still make you stop and breathe and pay attention, even if you could not explain why. The Celts did not need to write it down for it to be true. They did not need Rome's permission for it to matter. They did not need us to understand it in order for it to have shaped the world we live in. The knowledge persisted. The relationship persisted. The quiet, patient, enduring conversation between a people and their land persisted through conquest and conversion and the long, slow passage of centuries. It is still going on, right now. In the places where the old paths still wind through the hills, in the stories that grandmothers still tell without quite knowing where the stories came from, in the way that certain landscapes still hold something in them, some quality of attention, some sense of depth and presence, that reaches across thousands of years and touches something in us that is older than language. You do not need to go to Ireland to feel it. You do not need to stand on a Celtic hilltop or walk through an ancient bog. You simply need to be quiet enough and still enough and patient enough to notice what has always been there. The land remembers, the stories remember, and somewhere, in the long silence between one heartbeat and the next, the Celts are still speaking. Let the silence come now. Let it settle around you like snow, like mist, like the slow darkening of a sky at the end of a long autumn day. There is nothing left to say, and everything has been said. And both of these things are true at the same time. That is the Celtic way of it. That is the way of all the old knowledge that lived before the written word, and that will continue to live long after the last page has been turned. Sleep now. The land is quiet. The stories are resting. And somewhere, in the deep and ancient dark, the conversation continues.